Hello, my name is Valerie Wilson and I'm Curator of Textiles at the Ulster Folk Museum at Cultraw. Now, under normal circumstances, I would be working from the textiles department in the museum, but obviously while we're all in lockdown, like everybody else, I'm confined to home. Although this is a corner of my sewing room at home, so I do feel quite in my normal habitat because I'm still surrounded by books and textiles. This is the first in what I hope will be a series of vlogs to introduce you to aspects of the textiles collection in the Folk Museum while we're actually all separated from the museum itself. What I want to talk about today is linen. Linen was such a vital part of the textile history of Ulster, and probably because we're all in this unusual circumstance at the minute, it did occur to me recently that this lockdown may last for a few months, who knows? But actually, there's quite a lot of very positive things that can be done, can be made, and can be created in the space of around 100 days. And linen is actually a good example of that because in the past, it took 100 days for around 100 or 120 days for the flax to grow from seed to being pulled or harvested. And the blog that I've written, which you can find on the museum's website, among other interesting blogs, is actually charting that history of those 100 or so days from the very first part of the process to the end of the process. The first part of the process, of course, was sowing the seeds, and these would generally have been sown in the springtime. I've based my blog on a stunning series of photographs from the early 1900s taken by a County Antrim photographer called William Green. And I base a lot of my work on the photographic archives in the National Museum's NI collection. If you want to lose yourself for a whole afternoon or a whole day in that collection, please do via the website. The photographs in question that I've referred to and used chart processes that were involved in the making of linen in the early 1900s in Ulster. The photographs were taken at a time when people were just starting to maybe lose those traditional handcraft skills, and when every part of the linen process was being turned into a mechanised process taking place in huge factories dotted across the country. So as such, they're a very valuable resource to use. The start of the process is the sowing of the flax seed, and that would have been sown in springtime. And the blog looks at one of the processes involved in sowing these seeds by hand by a method known as broadcasting, where people would actually walk down a field and literally throw the seed from side to side from a sack. And that seed would then take around 100 days to 120 or so, depending on the weather, to actually bloom and come to its full height. Now, one of the things that could control that time span is the weather, and linen or flax actually needs a sort of moderate and slightly damp climate to thrive in. So obviously, part of the world is ideal for growing flax. Once the flax had bloomed, and it bloomed with a lovely distinctive little blue flower, so it was often known as the wee blue blossom. Once it actually flowered and had reached its full height, it was then ready to be pulled. It was pulled generally rather than cut, because until a process was involved and machinery was developed in the 1940s for cutting it, it had to be pulled by hand. It was backbreaking work, but it meant that you didn't lose any of the fibre. It meant that you got the full length of it and you weren't losing 3 or 4 inches if you were cutting it by hand. The retting part of the process in processing flax was probably the messiest and most unpleasant part of the process. It involved taking the sort of bundles or sticks of the cut flax and taking them and laying them in still water in what were known as lint dams or retting dams. Retting was the process where the flax was laid out in still water. The reason it wasn't laid out in running water is because you needed the still water to turn stagnant. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? But the stagnant water, as it got more and more stagnant, actually created bacteria. and the bacteria in the water broke down the outer sort of woody husk of the flax, because what you wanted to get to eventually was all the lovely lustrous fibres in the centre. Now, I've never experienced that smell. My mother, who was from near Ballymena, told me that she still remembered it from childhood. The nearest equivalent I can think of is once I went off on holiday and left a vase of cut flowers in a vase for a few weeks in full view of a sunny window. When I came back, the flowers had rotted away. The smell was horrendous. I think if you multiply that by about 100, you got a rough idea of what that would have smelt like. But it did actually work. The outer husk would have been broken down, and then the flax would have been taken out of the Retting dam whenever it was considered to be right, and laid out then to be dried out. The next stage of the process was what was called scutching, because to get at those lovely lustrous fibres in the centre of the flax for spinning, you needed to get rid of the woody outer core. By hand, that process involved basically thumping it with a big, long wooden paddle, sort of long, narrow paddle to smash the outer core away. Eventually, of course, scutch mills were set up and they mechanised that process. They were generally water powered, and they powered a series of paddles that could in turn work through larger quantities of the flax to get at that inner fibre. I think even that was quite an unpleasant process, because the operators who were feeding those paddles had to be very careful about how they did it. You could easily have ended up with a smashed finger, or even lost a finger in that process. Once you had the outer core removed, and sometimes that outer core could be recycled or repurposed into some animal feeds. But once you had the outer core removed, you could then get at the real product in the centre. And that went on to a process called hackling. Hackling involved pulling that inner core of fibres over a series of metal combs, and they got progressively finer and finer. And again, the nearest equivalent I can think of is if you have a tangle of hair and you take a hairbrush to separate out the tangles. It's hard work maybe to start off with, but as you get on, it eventually gets smoother and finer. So once you work the flax yarn over the series of combs, you will end up with a long strand or long strands of nice lustrous fibre. And if you've ever heard the phrase flaxen hair, that's really what hackled flax would look like. It can actually look quite like human hair. And from then, the next process obviously is to spin that into yarn that can then be woven into the linen cloth. In the blog, one of the photographs shows two women in a rural setting. One of them is hand spinning flax yarn, and the other one is winding the spun yarn on what's called a clock wheel, and that is to actually wind it into a hank. Now, it could take the work of up to 4 spinners to produce enough yarn for a weaver to work from. So you can see already the advantages of working in a mechanised process in a big factory, where a spinning frame could spin flax into yarn in huge quantities and so much quicker. But whenever the yarn was ready for weaving, it would have gone either to a hand weaver, or as we get into the late 19th century and certainly into the early 20th century, it would be going to feed the huge factories that were churning out enormous quantities of linen for the whole world. In the museum, we have our own hand linen weaver. My colleague Roisin Easton works on an early 1900s loom in the Ballydugan Weaver's House, where you can actually see what a how a hand loom weaver would have lived and worked in the early 1900s. Ulster was particularly associated with really fine quality linens, and the proceeds of the linen industry underpinned so much of our local economic history, including the shipbuilding industry. And if you look today, even in Royal Avenue, Donegal Place, you'll see so many of those buildings would originally have been either linen warehouses or shops selling linens. The Robinson Cleaver's shop in its heyday at the end of the 19th century actually had its own workrooms and employed its own embroiderers for the finishing and decorating of these enormous quantities of beautiful, beautiful high quality linens. It's been estimated that at the end of the 19th century, about 1/3 of the parcel post that went through the post office in Belfast for mail order across the world was simply for that one Robinson Cleaver's shop. And that gives an indication of just how high quality were the goods that they were selling. There were all sorts of related industries and spin-off industries for linen, including the industry for the embroidery, hand embroidery of linens. And lots of women in the early 1900s were still able to earn a living by working as outworkers. They got to work in their own homes, producing lovely embroidered handkerchiefs, christening robes, bed linens, table linens for agents who in turn were working for the large linen companies. It wasn't the worst way to earn your living. A lot of folklore will talk about the terrible conditions and the very poor pay that these women received. But actually, if a young girl was embroidering 4 dozen handkerchiefs a week, she would have earned the same money that an equivalent farm labourer would have earned at the time. And for most young girls, given the choice between sitting in your own home, embroidering handkerchiefs, or working in damp, very dark, noisy linen mills, I think the embroidery option was the better choice. The shops in Belfast that were particularly associated with the linen trade would have been Robinson Cleavers, Anderson Macaulay's, the Bank Buildings, and Smith's Linens in the centre of Belfast, Deal Island Hall. The two major linen firms left in Ulster at the minute would be Ferguson's or John England's Textiles down in Banbridge, who, among other things at the minute, make linens for the costumes for the Game of Thrones tapestry programme. William Clark and Sons in Upperlands are at the forefront of some very beautiful, very contemporary textiles and also traditional textiles, woven and printed. And there are, here and there are a few people still growing some small amounts of flax around the country. If you visit the Folk Museum, we're lucky enough to have all sorts of aspects of linen reflected in what we do around the site. We do grow small amounts of flax from time to time, and we pull that so that we can show those traditional hackling and scutching and preparation processes. I have a colleague who spins flax, a colleague who weaves linen, several colleagues who embroider, and we also have a beautiful draper's shop with a window full of finished linens. So we feel at the Folk Museum we can actually tell the story from the sewing of seeds to the sewing of seams. And later this year, we hope to introduce a new trail around the museum where you can come on a visit and follow that process from start to finish around the site. The blog that I've written on linen is one of many blogs that you can find on the museum's website on a variety of subjects. I will be introducing some more blogs as time goes on, looking at the various ways in which linen was used for embroidery and for craft projects. So between the blogs on the museum's website and those photographic archives, there should be lots for you to see while you're separated, as I am, from the collection and from the museum. And I want to leave the linen blog on a positive note, because a lot of people focus on the fact that we've sort of lost our linen industry. I don't think we've lost it completely, and I'm very excited by the fact that the big fashion house Alexander McQueen has based so much of their spring and summer collection for this year on linen, on flax, and particularly on a range of beautiful outfits based on a field of flax that was grown locally here. So I do hope that you and your family all stay safe and stay well. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.